I will need you to state your legal justification for this stop before we go any further.
Is that badge right there, sweetheart? You don't get a question. Get out of the vehicle and face the hood now! My justification is that badge there, right, sweetheart?
You absolutely do need
Get out of the vehicle!
legal justification for this stop before we go any further.
I don't care.
To jail.
Simply was that. Turn the damn camera off.
District Judge Zoraide Thorne thought Tuesday morning was going to be like every other Tuesday morning. Coffee, case files, and 4 blocks to the courthouse. She had no idea that in the next 14 minutes, she would single-handedly end Officer Kaylin Wolf's 15-year career, expose a pattern of corruption that had been buried inside the Charlotte Police Department for over a decade, and set into motion a federal prosecution that would put the man who arrested her behind the very kind of bars she had spent 20 years sentencing others to. Wolf's body camera recorded every word, every sneer, and every moment his professionalism collapsed into something much uglier. And when that footage dropped 3 days later, it didn't just go viral. It opened a case file that investigators would spend the next 2 years filling. Before we break down this extraordinary story of power meeting accountability, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment. Have you ever watched someone's arrogance become the exact thing that destroyed them? Because what Officer Wolf did that morning didn't just cost him everything. It cost him his freedom. Zoraide Thorne had never needed anyone to tell her she was powerful. She had figured that out the hard way, in a world that spent a long time trying to convince her otherwise. She grew up in a small house in West Charlotte, the youngest of 4 children, with a mother who worked double shifts at the hospital and a father who read to her from the Constitution before bed like it was a bedtime story. He told her the law was the closest thing to a promise that society ever made to its people. He told her it was worth holding on to. He told her it was worth fighting for. She believed him. She still did. She graduated from Johnson C. Smith University with honors, earned her law degree from UNC Chapel Hill, and spent the first 8 years of her career as a public defender. The kind of lawyer who takes the cases no one else wants, who shows up at 6 a.m. for clients who have nothing and fights like they have everything. She was relentless. She was precise. And she was, by every account of everyone who ever sat across from her in a courtroom, impossible to rattle. She was appointed to the district bench at 39. By 45, she was one of the most respected judges in Mecklenburg County. By 52, she had presided over more than 8,000 cases, written rulings that were cited across the state, and built a reputation for fairness that even the attorneys who lost in her courtroom admitted was earned. She was known for 3 things. First, her memory. She could recall case law the way other people recalled song lyrics, effortlessly and exactly. Second, her voice. Low, steady, and precise. A voice that a courtroom full of people went quiet for without being asked. Third, and most important, her standard. Zoraide Thorne held everyone in her courtroom to the same rules. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, law enforcement, elected officials, it made no difference who you were when you stood before her bench. The law applied to everyone equally, or it applied to no one at all. She drove herself to work every morning in a black sedan she kept immaculately clean. She left her house at 7:50 a.m., stopped at the same coffee shop on Trade Street for a medium dark roast with no sugar, and arrived at the courthouse by 8:20. It was a routine she had kept for over 2 decades, as steady and reliable as the woman herself. On a Tuesday morning in late September, she left the coffee shop at 8:11 and turned onto the boulevard that ran straight to the courthouse. The sky was clear. The docket was full. She had a sentencing hearing at 9 and a civil motion at 11, and she was already thinking through both. She had no reason to expect that morning to be anything other than ordinary. She was 4 blocks away from the courthouse when the lights came on behind her. Kaylin Wolf had been a police officer for 15 years, and somewhere in the middle of all that time, he had stopped thinking of himself as a public servant and started thinking of himself as a hunter. It hadn't happened all at once. It crept in slowly, the way bad habits do. One corner cut here, one complaint ignored there, one supervisor who looked the other way because the paperwork was easier than the conversation. By the time Wolf was a decade into the job, the shift was complete. He wasn't patrolling a community, he was working a territory. He was 38 now, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with a way of standing that took up more space than necessary. He had a voice built for commands and a face that didn't do warmth. His fellow officers described him in careful language: aggressive, results-driven, hard to work with. The officers who had been around long enough described him in plainer terms when no supervisors were nearby. He had a specialty, and everyone in the department knew it, even if no one had ever said it out loud in a formal setting. Wolf targeted luxury vehicles driven by black drivers in upscale parts of Charlotte. He called it proactive enforcement. He told newer officers it was about deterrence. What it actually was, as the data would eventually show, was a pattern so consistent it could only be called deliberate. In 15 years, Wolf had filed more traffic stop reports than almost any other officer in the district. His stops rarely produced anything: no weapons, no warrants, no crimes. What they produced was paperwork. Paperwork and fear, spread across a community that had learned to grip the steering wheel a little tighter when they saw his cruiser in the mirror. 43 formal complaints had been filed against Wolf over the course of his career. 43. Most were dismissed at the departmental level. A few were noted, filed, and forgotten. Not one had resulted in disciplinary action beyond a single written warning in his third year. The code of silence that protected him wasn't dramatic or conspiratorial. It was bureaucratic. It was the quiet machinery of a department that promoted its clearance numbers and ignored its complaint numbers, and told itself that was the same as accountability. On that Tuesday morning, Wolf was running his usual route through the uptown corridor when a black sedan passed him doing 31 miles per hour in a 30 zone. He would later write in his report that the vehicle made an unsafe lane change. Footage from 3 separate traffic cameras would later show no such lane change had occurred. He hit the lights anyway. He pulled out behind the sedan with the same energy he always had, certain, aggressive, and completely sure of himself. He had no idea what he was driving toward. Zoraide saw the lights in her mirror and felt the particular familiar tightening that black drivers know. The one that has nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with experience. She signaled, pulled smoothly to the curb, and put the car in park. She placed both hands on the wheel where they could be seen. She had done this before. She knew exactly how to do this. She also knew her rights down to the letter, because she had spent 20 years ruling on cases that turned on exactly those rights. Wolf was out of his cruiser before it fully stopped, moving toward her car with the stride of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. He reached her window and tapped it hard with one knuckle. She lowered it. "License and registration," he said, without greeting, without introduction, without any of the procedural courtesy that the department's own training manual required. "Good morning," Zoraide said, her voice calm and even. "Before I provide anything, I'd like to know the reason for this stop." Wolf's expression tightened. "Lane change violation, license and registration." "I did not make an unsafe lane change," she said. "I'd like your name and badge number, please, and the specific statute you're citing." "My name is on my badge. You can read." He leaned slightly into the window. "Get out your documents." "Officer Wolf," she said, reading the badge herself. "Under the Fourth Amendment, a traffic stop requires reasonable suspicion of a specific violation. I am asking you to state that violation clearly so that I can note it." "You're going to note it," he repeated, and the mockery in his voice was unmistakable. "That's cute. Out of the vehicle." "I am not required to exit the vehicle without." "I said out." Zoraide looked at him for one long moment. She was not afraid. That was the thing that seemed to confuse him most. She was not performing bravery, not pushing back out of pride. She was simply stating facts, the way she had done from the bench every single day for over 2 decades, because facts were the only currency the law accepted. "Officer Wolf," she said, and her voice dropped to the register that cleared a courtroom. "I am going to give you one opportunity to check the name on my vehicle registration before this situation becomes something neither of us can walk back easily." He pulled the door open. "Out. Now, or I'm pulling you out." She stepped out. She was wearing a long charcoal coat over her judicial attire, and as she stood on the pavement of a busy Charlotte boulevard at 8:15 in the morning, With commuters slowing to look and 2 phones already raised from the sidewalk, she stood straight, hands visible, face composed. She was giving him every chance to stop. He had no interest in stopping. What happened next was recorded from 4 different angles. Wolf's own body camera. A dash cam from a delivery truck stopped at the light 30 feet away. A cell phone held by a woman on the sidewalk who had recognized Zoraide the moment she stepped out of the car. And a second phone from a man walking his dog who stopped, watched, and kept the camera steady for the full 4 minutes that followed. Wolf ordered Zoraide to face the hood of her car. She complied, slowly and deliberately, placing her hands flat on the warm metal. She was calm. She had not raised her voice once. "You think you're something special?" Wolf said, moving behind her. "Fancy car, fancy coat, you people always think the rules don't apply." "You people," Zoraide said quietly, and her voice was so level it sounded almost like a recording. "I want you to know that your body camera just captured that phrase. I don't care what it captured." He pulled her hands behind her back and clicked the cuffs on. As he did, her coat shifted, and the collar of her judicial robe, the one she always wore beneath her coat on court mornings, came into view. The black fabric, the white detail at the collar, clear and unmistakable to anyone who had ever set foot in a courtroom. The woman on the sidewalk made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The delivery truck driver had stopped watching his light. Wolf did not notice any of it. He was still talking, something about attitude and learning a lesson. As he walked Zoraide toward his cruiser, she said nothing more. She did not argue, did not struggle, did not give him a single frame of footage that could be spun into resistance. She walked to the cruiser with her back straight and her chin level, and she got in, and she sat, and she was quiet. But her mind was not quiet. Her mind was doing what it had done for 30 years in rooms full of powerful men who underestimated her. It was building, cataloging every word, every timestamp, every procedural violation in the order it occurred. Illegal stop, no stated reasonable suspicion, racially charged language on camera, unlawful detention, wrongful arrest, false reporting of a traffic violation. By the time Wolf pulled back onto the boulevard, Zoraide Thorne had already constructed the skeleton of what would eventually become a federal case. Outside, the woman on the sidewalk was already uploading. The delivery driver was calling his dispatcher. The dog walker was texting his wife, who worked at a news station. Kalen Wolf drove toward the precinct completely certain he had won something. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. The Charlotte Police Department's Uptown precinct at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning was busy in the ordinary way. Phones, keyboards, the smell of old coffee, officers coming and going through the main door. Desk Sergeant Frank Okafor had processed dozens of people through that door in his 12 years at the precinct. He had seen everything. He had not seen this. The door opened. Wolf walked in with a woman in handcuffs, and Okafor looked up the way he always did. Quick, automatic, professional. And then he stopped. He knew that face. Everyone in the Mecklenburg County criminal justice system knew that face. Judge Zoraide Thorne's photograph was in the lobby of the courthouse he drove past every single morning. He had personally appeared before her bench twice in his career as a witness. He had heard her voice in recorded rulings played during department training sessions. The coat had shifted further during the drive. The judicial robe was clearly visible now. Frank Okafor stood up very slowly. "Wolf," he said. "Obstruction and failure to comply," Wolf said, moving toward the processing area like a man who had done this 1,000 times and expected no pushback. "Routine stop," she made it difficult. "Wolf." Okafor's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the voice of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds were going to determine a great many things. "Stop walking." Wolf stopped. Okafor came around the desk and stood in front of both of them, and his eyes moved from Wolf to Zoraide and back to Wolf, with an expression that Zoraide would later describe in a deposition as a man watching a building fall over in slow motion. "Do you know who this is?" Okafor asked. "A civilian who refused to cooperate," Wolf said. "This is Judge Zoraide Thorne," Okafor said. "District Judge. She runs the courtroom that processes every case out of this precinct." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Later, the officer at the nearest desk said it felt much longer. Wolf's face did something complicated. The certainty flickered. Something underneath it. Not quite fear, not yet, but the first thin crack of it showed through. Zoraide looked at Sergeant Okafor with the same steady composure she had maintained since the moment Wolf's lights appeared in her mirror. "Sergeant," she said, "I would like these removed, please." She turned slightly so he could see the cuffs. "And then I will need a phone, a copy of the incident report, and the name of your supervising lieutenant." Okafor had the cuffs off in under 30 seconds. Wolf stood very still in the middle of the room. Around him, the precinct had gone, the particular quiet of a place where everyone has heard something they know is important. The police chief was reached by phone at 8:47 a.m. He was in the parking lot of the precinct by 9:03. He did not look at Wolf when he arrived. He went straight to Zoraide, extended his hand and said, "Judge Thorne, I am deeply sorry." She shook his hand. She did not tell him it was all right, because it wasn't. The body cam footage was released to the public at 6:15 on Thursday evening, 2 days after the arrest. By 6:45, it was the top trending topic in North Carolina. By midnight, it had been viewed 11 million times. People watched it over and over. Not because it was hard to follow, it was devastatingly easy to follow, but because of the specific, almost unbelievable clarity of what it showed. Wolf's voice, casual and contemptuous. Zoraide's voice, steady and precise. The phrase, "you people," landing like a stone in still water. The judicial robe visible at the collar. And then Wolf's face in the precinct, the moment the certainty broke open. That moment, the crack, was the part people replayed most. But it was a different section of the footage that the legal community focused on. 37 seconds, roughly 3 minutes into the stop, where Wolf leaned back against his cruiser, while Zoraide stood cuffed against her car and said, to no one in particular, "She actually thinks she's a judge." Then he laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Okay. Sure." He had said it directly to his own body camera. He had been so confident, so completely sure that this was just another stop, just another person to be processed and forgotten, that it hadn't even occurred to him to be careful. Civil rights attorneys across the country flagged that clip within hours of release. It wasn't just evidence of a bad arrest, it was evidence of willful disregard, of deliberate contempt, of a man who had been doing this for so long and had faced so few consequences that he no longer felt the need to hide it. The Charlotte Police Department issued a statement at 9 p.m. Thursday suspending Wolf without pay pending investigation. The statement was 2 paragraphs. The comment section under the post received over 40,000 replies before the department turned it off. Zoraide did not watch the footage publicly or comment on it to the press. Her attorney, a federal civil rights litigator named Marcus Ellerby, released a single statement on her behalf. Judge Thorne is well and is cooperating fully with all relevant investigations. She asks that the community allow the legal process to proceed, and she assures them it will. The last 4 words were Zoraide's own. Everyone who knew her understood exactly what they meant. The investigation that began the following Monday would take 14 months to complete. It would produce a report 412 pages long, and it would open a file on Keelan Wolf that had been waiting, buried and ignored, for 15 years. The internal affairs investigation into Officer Keelan Wolf began on a Monday morning and did not stop for over a year. What the investigators found, what had been sitting inside the department's own records the entire time, was the kind of evidence that makes experienced officers go quiet when they read it. 43 complaints. That was the number everyone kept coming back to. 43 formal complaints filed against Wolf over 15 years by people who had been stopped, harassed, threatened, and in several cases physically handled without legal justification. The complaints came from doctors, teachers, college students, a high school principal, a retired firefighter, and a 14-year-old boy who had been walking home from basketball practice. Every single one of them was black. Every single one of them had been stopped in an upscale area of Charlotte, and every single one of their complaints had been reviewed, logged, and closed without disciplinary action. 3 of the complaints had been filed by people who were, at the time of their stop, wearing uniforms from other city departments. a transit worker, a hospital administrator in scrubs, a city building inspector with his badge clipped to his jacket. Wolf had not noticed or had not cared. The investigators also pulled his traffic stop data, going back a decade. The numbers were not subtle. In predominantly white neighborhoods, Wolf's stop rate was low and his citation rate was high, meaning he pulled people over when he had a clear, documentable reason. In predominantly black neighborhoods, and in upscale corridors where black professionals drove expensive cars, his stop rate was high and his citation rate was almost nothing. Stops without findings. Stops findings. Stops without cause. Stops that served no legal purpose anyone could identify. Marcus Ellerby, Zoraid's attorney, had requested this data in the first week of the investigation. When it arrived, he spread the pages across a conference table and stood looking at them for a long time without saying anything. "This isn't a pattern," he said finally. "This is a program." 12 of the 43 complainants agreed to speak to federal investigators. Several of them said the same thing in different ways. They had filed their complaint and then waited and then heard nothing, and eventually they had decided that nothing was all they were going to get. One man, a 40-year-old architect who had been stopped 3 separate times in 2 years, said he had stopped filing complaints because it felt like dropping a letter into a wall. What none of them had known, what Zoraide had not known either, standing at her car window on that Tuesday morning, was that they were not alone. There were 12 of them, and then there were 43 of them. And when the federal investigation was complete, there would be more. The department had a Wolf problem. It had always had one. It had just chosen, over and over again, not to look. The federal trial of Kaylin Wolf began on a Wednesday in April, 16 months after the arrest. The courtroom was full every single day. Wolf was charged with 4 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal civil rights statute that makes it a crime for a law enforcement officer to use the power of their badge to violate someone's constitutional rights. He was also charged with 2 counts of falsifying official police reports, stemming from his written claim that Zoraide had made an unsafe lane change when 3 camera systems confirmed she had not. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough, and by the end of the second week, almost impossible to argue against. The body cam footage, the traffic camera data, the 43 complaints, and the 12 witnesses who traveled to Charlotte to testify in person. The stop data analysis, presented by an expert who had done pattern studies for the Department of Justice, and who spent 2.5 hours on the stand explaining, in clear and simple terms, what 15 years of numbers looked like when you actually read them. Wolf's defense argued that the stop was legitimate, that Zoraide had been uncooperative, and that the lane change had occurred in a blind spot the traffic cameras had missed. They argued that the complaint history reflected a targeting of their client by people looking for leverage against a tough officer. They argued that Wolf had devoted 15 years to public service and deserved the benefit of the doubt. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. Marcus Ellerby sat with Zoraide in a conference room near the courthouse during both days of deliberations. She read case files. She ate a sandwich. She was, by every description of those present, exactly the same as she always was, composed, focused, and completely without the need for anyone to reassure her. "You're not nervous," Ellerby said at one point. It was not quite a question. "I've read the evidence," she said. "I'm not nervous." The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon, guilty on all 6 counts. Wolf sat very still when the foreperson read it. His attorney placed a hand on his arm. He did not react. He looked, one reporter wrote, like a man who had finally arrived somewhere he had always been headed and simply hadn't known it. Sentencing was scheduled for 60 days later. Zoraide did not attend the verdict reading in person. She was in her courtroom, 4 blocks away, where she had a full docket and a job to do. She heard the verdict by phone during a 10-minute recess and said only, "Good." Then she returned to the bench. Kaylin Wolf was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week as the arrest. A coincidence that no one mentioned aloud, but everyone noticed. The federal judge cited the sustained and deliberate nature of Wolf's conduct, the number of victims, the falsified report, and what she called a complete and willful abuse of the public trust that was placed in him by the people of this city. She noted that the evidence showed not a single moment of poor judgment, but 15 years of choices, made over and over again, that caused real harm to real people who deserved better. Wolf was taken into custody immediately. He had no statement. Zoraide was not in the courtroom. She was at the police department, where she had been for most of the previous month, working alongside the police chief, the city manager, and a team of legal and policy experts on what would become known as the Thorn Standards, a comprehensive reform package that reshaped how the Charlotte Police Department handled officer conduct. The Thorn Standards did several things. They created a mandatory public database of officer stop records, updated monthly, sortable by officer, location, race of the person stopped, and outcome of the stop. They required that any officer with more than 5 unresolved complaints in a 3-year period be automatically reviewed by an independent civilian panel. Not internal affairs, not the department itself, but a panel with no loyalty to the badge. They established a formal policy requiring dashcam and bodycam footage to be reviewed within 48 hours of any complaint, with supervisors held personally accountable for delayed reviews. And they created something Zoraide had pushed hardest for: a direct reporting line for stopped civilians. A city-run portal where anyone could log a stop, describe what happened, and receive a written response within 30 days. Not a complaint form that went to the same department being complained about. A separate, independent channel with teeth. The day the Thorn Standards were formally adopted by the city council, Zoraide drove herself home the same way she always did. Trade Street, straight shot, coffee from the same shop. She sat at her kitchen table and called her mother in West Charlotte, who was 81 years old and still sharp as glass. "It passed," Zoraide said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have liked to see that." Zoraide thought about a man who read her the Constitution before bed, who told her the law was the closest thing to a promise society ever made, who told her it was worth holding on to. "He did see it," she said. "He just saw it a long time ago." She finished her coffee. She had a full docket in the morning. She went to bed early, and she slept without difficulty, and in the morning she drove to the courthouse and took her place on the bench where she had always belonged.